So it's time to take this baby apart and see why is it making those clucking noises. So I drained the oil and started disassembling the front end. And right away there was the first surprise. Look at the tensioner. It was assembled in such a way that it was under the gear on the crankshaft. So the chain wasn't getting any tension at all. This is where it was supposed to be. But somebody installed it in the wrong way. Anyways, I kept going forward. And there's the second surprise coming. This crankshaft is traveling a lot. The end float is significant. It is supposed to be between 6 and 8 thousandths of an inch, which you almost can't see with your eyes, but here you can see how much does it travel. So I'm gonna measure that later, and I started taking out this sleeve, which is damaged. You can see there's a big mark on it, so it had to be changed anyways. That's why I wasn't afraid to use a screwdriver to remove it. And then I turned the engine upside down. Oops, excuse me, it's a heavy engine. So I removed the sump. And here you can see the end play is huge. This is a common problem with the TR6s, because there are only 2 thrust washers on the crankshaft, and obviously we can't trust them. The oil pump was also something that worried me, because you know there was no oil pressure on the gauge. I guess something else is wrong, because the oil pump looked very well. There were no scratches or damages on it. I measured also the clearances between the inner and outer rotor, between the outer rotor and the body, and also the end float of the rotors, and everything was within tolerance. In one of my videos about the TR4 engine rebuild, I explain in details how an oil pump works and how to measure the clearances and what the tolerances are. It's pretty much the same thing here. I took out the connecting rod cups and the main bearing cups and checked all the bearings. Most of them had significant scratches on them, like they were really damaged from the diluted oil. Now was a good moment to measure the end float of the crank, and because it wasn't that important right now, I didn't want to take out the micrometers and magnetic holders and stuff, so I just measured the gap between the crank and the thrust washer with the filler gauge. Okay, so right now I have clearance of these are all the leaves, so I have 8 plus 7 is 15, plus 6 is 21, plus 5 26. So I have end float of 26 thousandths of an inch, which is more than 4 times the required end float of 6 to 8 thousandths of an inch. So never trust the thrust washers. So I pulled out the crank, put it on the bench, and it was time to pull out the measuring equipment. I inspected the crank pins and the journals, and they had some minor marks on them which I believed could be polished. So I wanted to measure and see if the crank required machining. I wasn't gonna do anything about those marks, but if it didn't, I could attempt polishing on the bench and try to avoid sending the crank to a machine shop. Again, I'm not gonna go into too many details here because I have a separate video about measuring a crankshaft and determining a bearing size. If you wanna see that, you can follow this link. And here it turned out that the crank was machined once already, because the main journals corresponded to standard size bearings, but the crank pins corresponded to 0.010 bearing size, and they weren't out of round, they weren't tapered, they were good, and if I managed to polish the little marks, everything would be good and I could just change the bearings without sending the crankshaft to a machine shop. So I started with the main journal right in the center of your screen because it had the biggest mark, which actually was just like a difference in the color, not a difference on the surface. I couldn't feel it with my finger, but I could see it right there. This method of polishing I saw many years ago. An old mechanic was polishing a crankshaft this way, and just recently I saw somebody else in YouTube doing that, and actually the results were amazing, so I decided that's the first time I'm doing it myself, but it actually worked. So what I'm using here is 300 water sandpaper with WD-40 on it. Usually they use flat shoelace, but I didn't have any flat shoelaces actually. So I just took a piece of fabric and I stitched it together on the sewing machine so it's flat. I was turning every now and then the crank a little bit, just in case I was applying more pressure on one side than the other, but I couldn't take too much material with 300 sandpaper. And you see, it started working already. There was just a little mark still showing there, but I went one more time with the 300 and it almost disappeared. If you didn't know where it was, you couldn't find it probably. So I sprayed WD-40 again and kept going for another minute or so. And this time I was really satisfied with the result. So now that the mark was gone, I could switch to 400 sandpaper and polish it until it's shiny like a mirror. And as I said before, this main journal was the worst one from all the main journals and crank pins, so if it worked here, the rest was easy to do. Since the two compression tests that I did on the car were showing such nice results, I assumed that the valves were holding very well, but I just wanted to test them just in case, now that I had the engine open. So I poured gas into all the cylinders and I left it sitting for more than 2 hours, and now you're gonna see how much fuel did it disappear. I guess it evaporated because I didn't see any leaks underneath, under the head. So I was satisfied with this result as well, and it was time to measure the cylinders. Obviously the cylinders were rebored too recently, or recently kilometer wise I mean, because I could see that .010 pistons were fitted, and I measured all the cylinders for out of round, for taper and for size, and all of them measured very well. Out of round and taper were all within tolerances, and the only thing was that the number 6 cylinder was a little bit bigger than all the rest of the cylinders. It was still within the tolerance for 010 oversized pistons, but it was just a little bit bigger than the other cylinders. So what I wanted to do was also to measure all the pistons and find the biggest one of them and put it in number 6 cylinder. With that, everything was gonna be okay. For more details about how to measure the cylinders and how to calculate the taper and out of round, again you can check my video about the TR4 engine. It's the link that I showed you a couple of minutes ago. I'll put it also in the description. The piston rings, I had to order new ones because these ones were with a huge gap in the cylinders. They were measuring between 24 and 30 thousandths of an inch, and the ones in cylinder number 6, which was a little bit bigger as I said, were with 40 thousandths of an inch gap, which is weird because I don't understand how the engine had such a high compression with such a big gap on the piston rings, but obviously it is possible. And the last thing is I had to send the block for resurfacing because there were some obvious scratches on it, and also the surface didn't look very straight with the straight edge, so I had to send it to a machine shop for resurfacing only. But the good news was that the cylinders didn't need reboring or anything. And with that, all the measuring work was done, and I could order all the parts that I needed for the engine. When they arrived, I first started by doing some brain works. I mean, I needed to find which two pistons I could switch. I wanted to have a better piston to cylinder clearance for cylinder number 6 without affecting too much any of the other cylinders. And I figured that piston number 5 was a little bit bigger than the rest of the pistons, and maybe it was dedicated for cylinder number 6, but whoever assembled the engine didn't know that and just put it wherever they decided to. Anyway, so this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna switch piston number 5 with piston number 6, and this way the clearances in all the cylinders would be within tolerance. So with that done, I started dedicating piston rings. I was measuring the gap in position, and once a ring was fitted into a cylinder, they became couple, as I said before, and they couldn't be divorced anymore. I found which were the biggest rings, because there was a little bit difference, and I dedicated them for cylinder number 6. So with a little bit of playing, this ring goes here, that goes there, I managed to fit each and every one into a cylinder and still remain within the tolerances. And this super high technology digital Excel worksheet helped me keep all the rings separated, so I don't mix them up until I assemble them on the pistons. And the actual assembling on the pistons took just a couple of seconds with the help of the time-lapse technology. Oh, and by the way, something very important, I was measuring also the gap in the groove for each ring, because that's another tolerance that needs to be met, but all of them were within the tolerance, so I was happy with that too. And at the end I put them in a plastic container and covered them with some spices and let them sit overnight, because that's how the taste was gonna be even better.